So just look, we don't want to be pessimists here, but the economic climate is a little bit challenging compared to when we last spoke here in November, ever changing. And so we're going to focus a little bit on sort of current conditions here. So I'm just going to ask you, Bill, what do you see as sort of the current conditions right now? How is that influencing investment philosophy and strategies?
So the good news is we're starting to finally see a turnaround. We're seeing an uptick in funding. That being said, we're not out of the woods yet. And then certainly what affected us and most other investors, in 20 and 21, we didn't exit the number of companies we normally exit, which is anywhere from 3 to 5. So our portfolio now got bloated to 38 companies. And also in 20 and 21, like most firms, we raised a lot of debt, which is just kicking the can down the road. So what ended up happening the last 6 months of last year and what we've actually done the first 6 months of this year is mostly focus on the current portfolio. Like everybody else, we had to make sure that, with 38 companies, that they had enough cash not only to get through the end of this year, but perhaps at least the first quarter of next year or second quarter, because that's when we're going to, I believe, at least through the first quarter is when we're really going to start to see the turnaround where I think the public markets will open up as well as, funding really start to get back to sort of normal times. But because of those conditions, then what's ended up happening is we didn't do as many new investments as we typically do. Because it's really a lot of management. And again, that's a big portfolio that we have. And then making sure, that size portfolio that they can actually survive. And, like anybody, we've had a couple companies that, I'm not sure what the outcome is going to be by the end of the year, but, overall, I would say we did pretty good in managing, our current portfolio. From a broad investment thesis and strategy, nothing's actually really changed for us, generally speaking. The one thing, though, that for us as a growth firm, and we also have a small private equity firm associated with us, is that when you have these kind of downturns, we actually see it as an opportunity where consolidation is a potential big play for us, where you have a lot of really good assets. There's nothing really wrong with them other than that they probably raised, not enough capital or at the wrong valuation, but they're actually pretty good companies. And the whole idea is if you can find, two really good companies that you can put together, not two bad companies, but two really good companies, and form even a better company and start to build the scale you want. We actually think this year is a really great consolidation year. And so one of the things we're doing is we're ramping up our private equity firm, and we're looking for consolidation opportunities across the areas we invest. So we're being a little more opportunistic about it. And then we also believe in the second half of the year, we'll get back to starting new investments again with exits kind of coming on the horizon. We feel pretty confident that we'll exit a few this year, get back to our normal pace of exiting next year, and kind of rebuild the portfolio again with new investments.
Maybe just talk for a minute about that distinction between private equity and growth model for those that are looking to raise capital and how you view that in well.
Right, so we have our venture firm, which is typically our growth equity firm, and what that means is that we typically do Series C or later. We'll do an A and B round occasionally, but we're that firm that comes in when you typically have $5 million in revenue or more, and you're really looking to blow out the company, whether it's sales or marketing or geographic expansion or M&A or whatever you're trying to do. And we typically write a pretty decent check, anywhere from that $10 to $20 million check to get you moving, and put a pretty large sum together. Usually, the company's raising anywhere from $20 to $50 million in capital. What happens with the private equity firm and why we use that? That's really where we use that to build scale and consolidate assets, where we may or may not take the lead. Typically, we like to work with other private equity firms, but we're talking about putting in $100, $150 million of cash into the company, where we're merging two companies together. We may be even consolidating another asset, and we're building a bigger and better company, but it does take quite a bit of capital. So we might deploy anywhere from $30 to $50 million of capital, which is well beyond what the venture fund can do. But it's another tool in the toolbox for us, in order to continue, in a sense, bigger growth, equity than we do with the fund. So it just gives us another option, should we want to say, because one of the hardest things in digital health, healthcare is still local and regional, and it doesn't scale like regular technology, for like Google, which scales overnight, across the US or across the world. Healthcare takes a long time to scale beyond where it starts. And so one of the reasons we started the private equity firm years ago was that allows us actually to scale, in the areas that we want to much faster than we could, without having that sort of tool in the toolbox.
So you and I have often talked about, Merck's value, not only from the standpoint of obviously the economics and the financial strength that you bring, but really behind the scenes. And let's talk a little bit about that. How, when you come into an investment, you're not looking at it purely from an economic perspective. You're looking to add, much more value in other ways. Maybe perhaps you could talk a little bit about that.
Sure. So The one thing I do tell most corporates, which is a little kind of interesting, you can't just be strategic ultimately in the end. So we're both financial and strategic. And the reason you have to be financial is that without building a good, viable company that's economically viable and can last, there is no strategic value because that company's not going to be there. So we always take the approach first, can we build a good company? And then of course, the second piece is we're looking for strategic value from Merck. And the way we go about doing that is the first thing we do is we have something called enterprise coverage, and all that really means is how do we approach our parent company? And what we do is we go out and we meet with all the leaders of the different organizations within Merck, and we try to understand their use cases. And a use case is just something problem they're trying to solve. And what we do is we look for more enterprise-wide use cases because we can't do everything for Merck either. So we're looking for the use cases with the greatest impact. And then what we'll do is we'll try to identify whether or not we can solve that use case with equity. Equity is not always the right answer. Maybe it's M&A, which our business development group, or maybe it's a licensing agreement, maybe it's just a commercial agreement that has nothing to do with us, but we're looking for an opportunity to deploy capital in order to build the kind of company that Merck wants to work with. If we do find that company that we feel is appropriate, we'll go ahead and place that equity, and then we bring it inside Merck for an introduction to the right business department. Now, sometimes the business unit already actually knows the company and might already be working with it, and the equity might come second, or sometimes the equity's first, and then the commercial agreement comes second. But the whole idea is to really get Merck engaged and learn. One of the interesting things about our industry, which most people don't understand, is we're actually quite friendly. We were talking about this at dinner last night, that we work really well together as an industry in the sense that, forgetting the therapeutic side from it, on the digital health side, what we're trying to do is make sure assets exist in the world. And then the secret sauce is what we all do with it. So I actually syndicate with a lot of our competitors, which is very common. And the whole idea is there's plenty of firewalls in place that if Pfizer's better at doing something than Merck, then Merck better learn to use that technology and better. We don't need to own these assets, but we need these assets to exist in the world to make us better at what we do, whether it's using INM, artificial intelligence and machine learning in drug discovery. Well, if you can use that kind of technology better than your competitors, then you will be better than your competitors and get a drug to market faster. So that's the whole idea how we approach it. But the real main function is build a really good, viable company first, then get Merck involved from a strategic perspective so they can learn and do their business better than they did before. So either enhancing, augmenting, or changing the way they actually function.
So let's talk a little bit about your portfolios. You obviously have a broad breadth of companies in various different areas. You get to see across various spectrums, you see the good and the bad. Let's talk about the good first. What do you see as sort of some common themes of companies, past, present, perhaps even in the future, that you kind of look at and say, that's a company that's really progressing, that's a business team that's really progressing?
What's interesting is, more from a general perspective, the areas that we're seeing really big advancement, and more for the pharma industry, is, again, and I mentioned it, it's really in the drug discovery, drug development, and sort of operations part of R&D. And they're adopting because those technologies can actually really change the way the pharmaceutical company operates. So can you imagine if we invest in a company that does that AI and ML and drug discovery and has a target ID function, and they actually target a drug through technology 3 years sooner than they would the normal way they do it. Well, the cost savings not only to the system, pharma number one, and then to the patient, and getting the drug out faster, that's an incredible change to what happens today. So just generally some of the areas that we're really excited about is sort of that whole drug discovery and where we can bring these technologies in. Clinical operations is another place where pharma's got to begin to adopt and use technology the way you do clinical trials. Another big area for us that we've recently started investing in, and my colleague invested in, Joe Volpe, is this whole idea of using, where does digital exist within the supply chain and manufacturing? And it's not the physicality of manufacturing, but it's really thinking about the data and analytics and managing things like fraud, track and trace, damaged goods, shipping of goods. Do we ship it the right way? Using cold storage types of technologies, and then thinking about all the data, almost creating a control tower concept where we're really analyzing all the goods that come in, but then all the goods that go out. I think the last area that's really still interesting is and it's harder for us as a pharmaceutical-owned venture capital firm. Most people don't realize that we get more scrutiny because we're under anti-kickback statutes that prevent us from doing certain things. For example, I really like telemedicine, but I'm not allowed to invest in that because I can't be in a corporate practice of medicine. We can't have that undue influence on physicians. That being said, there's a lot of areas that we can invest in that's on the commercial side that we really like. We really like remote monitoring. I still think there's a big future for remote monitoring as You look at things like telemedicine, the monitoring piece still gets you more access and gets you, to more patients than you can. And these devices are faster, better, they're collecting more data. Health equity is going to be a big place. We still need to get access to patients. That's still the biggest problem on a global basis. And how do we do better, from the standpoint of health equity and understanding why is it a patient isn't getting access? Why isn't the patient not getting the drugs that they need, whether it's Merck's or anybody else's drugs, and getting the kind of health care that they need? So I think that's another big area that we're trying to focus on as well. So I'd say just from a broad stroke perspective, to me, those are the most exciting areas that we're going to focus on at least the next 24 months.
So let's just go back to a second on the logistics piece, because you were sharing with me a couple weeks ago, I think, just how that has impacted Merck's business over the past several years in terms of fraudulent products, mislabeled products, returns. Is that sort of the investment thesis to try to reduce some of that?
Yeah, it's more about creating efficiencies, but people don't realize that pharmaceutical companies, once something leaves the United States, it's a pretty high percentage of drugs that get either stolen, there's fraud, there's damaged goods, and we actually struggle with following those drugs once they leave. And what's happened is the technology's become so sophisticated. For example, there's a company we're investing in called Tag and Track, and it's a sophisticated labeling device that also manages temperature control, and we can actually track that product no matter where it is in the world, whether we're shipping it, and that becomes important. And even if it just gets damaged by accident, we know where it is, why it was damaged, then what do we need to do to either reclaim it, fix it, or whatever we have to do, or if it's been stolen. So all these technologies are more about efficiencies, but it's fundamentally changing also the way we get goods to patients. For example, we invested in a drone company that was really used heavily during COVID, where they're allowed to land on community hospital roofs and dropping off vaccines for patients that don't have access to it in these rural areas. So that's a whole different way to think about how you get medicines to patients. That's all part of the supply chain and manufacturing. So I think it's a combination of efficiencies and delivery methods is kind of what, and then data is the big thing that's behind the whole thing.
And has anything changed? Have you looked at certain philosophies, certain strategies over the last several years and pivoted, I won't say away, but not necessarily as focused on them because of the world we now live in? Probably
the one area that we still have an interest in it, but we've moved away from it because they're so hard to bring to market, is the diagnostic market. It just takes a lot of capital and a lot of years to get something to market. So we were heavily invested in a lot of diagnostic companies early in the fund. We've sort of moved away from it. But that being said, we're still very interested in diagnostics, especially since Merck is a biologics company now in oncology, so anything in oncology. But I think we're focusing more now, which is kind of a byproduct of diagnostics, is screening. We're really interested in screening, like lung cancer screening, skin cancer screening, like melanoma. So any type of screening has now become really important for us. Being an oncology company for the most part, and where does screening play a role in either prevention or quicker diagnosis and getting the patient on the right type of therapy that they need to be on. So it's kind of moving from pure diagnostics to screening. Interesting. So you mentioned a little bit about the climate that we're living in here. Let's talk a little bit about what we see, the balance of the year, perhaps going into the first part of next year. You've seen sort of a beginning of a settling of the market. What do you still see as sort of the headwinds? So I don't think the IPO market, we certainly saw at the end of 22, the SPAC market, IPO market, and the M&A market was down 95%. I think what we're starting to see is, I think it's going to be a little bit more time before the IPO market. The healthcare SPAC market just didn't work. So I would just push that aside for a moment. But at least from the M&A and IPO, I think IPO will pick up first quarter. We're starting to see some M&A now. And we're starting to actually see funding come back. The only thing I would say that's just still taking time, so there's plenty of capital coming back, but there's still a time frame that's a little longer to raise than what we anticipated in the past. So for example, it used to take 4 to 6 months to raise. I would just say it's now taking probably 8 to 12 months. So you just have to give yourself a little more time, at least over, I would say, the next 12-month period. So if you were looking to raise in the first quarter, start raising now, if you're an entrepreneur. Because it's just going to take a little extra time, but there is plenty of capital in the market, and the capital is coming back. I think the retreat of the venture capital firms, whether they were private firms or corporate firms, they're starting to come back. The one group that is actually heavily involved now, and we mentioned it just earlier, was the PE market. The private equity market, they're kind of frothing at the mouth, going, wow, there's a lot of opportunity to consolidate assets. we're seeing a lot of private equity money flowing into healthcare right now. So I think we're on a good turnaround right now, but it's like anything, it's slow. It's a long game with healthcare and digital health. You just got to be patient, but the money's there. It's starting to come back. We're seeing funding even of our 38 portfolio companies is really coming back now. We're not struggling like we were last year to raise, and that's the first sign you're looking for. You know, because even you would think growth companies wouldn't have trouble raising, but that's the group that's having more trouble than the A, B, and startup rounds. Yeah. But if I'm seeing my group come back, then I think for the most part, as the fourth quarter ends, we should normalize.
Well, that's a good way to end on a high note. So thank you for your time. We appreciate it. Enjoy the balance of the conference and enjoy the long weekend, hopefully. Thank you.
Thank you.